Hello, friends, and welcome to Spark My Muse. I'm your host, Lisa Colon-Delay. This is Soul School Lesson 306. Today I'm going to be bringing you an article in part from America's most influential journal of religion and public life, First Things, firstthings.com. And this is by David Bentley Hart, written in March 2015. I'm reading again from David Bentley Hart because I find his approach to logic really refreshing in a time when we have a lot of nonsense going around. I like his clear thinking, as erudite and pedantic as it can be sometimes. I'm not going to read the article in its entirety because it refers back to a previous article he wrote and some consternation people had with it, so I'm going to skip some of those parts. But I thought this was an interesting article that really provokes thought. So here goes. David writes, I learned in these pages not long ago that it is perilous to express doubts regarding the persuasive power of the most natural law theory in today's world. Not that I would dream of rehearsing the controversy again, but I will note that at the time I took my general point to not be that natural law theory is inherently futile, rather that its proponents often fail to grasp just how nihilistic the late modern view of reality has become, or how far our culture has gone towards losing any coherent sense of, quote, nature, unquote, at all, let alone any realm of moral meanings to which nature might afford access. In our time, any argument from immanent good to transcendent ends must be prepared for by an attempt to, quote, recover the world, unquote, so to speak, in deeper, wider tuition of sensibility, imagination, and natural reverence. At some point in the early modern period, it became possible and then normal to think of reason as an essentially dispassionate and disinterested faculty capable of discerning first principles and deducing final conclusions without any surd of the irrational left over, and of, quote, faith, as an essentially unreasoning paroxysm of the will, prompted by nameless yearnings and intuitions and hopes. Thereafter one might still talk of, quote, rational faith or of, quote, faithful reasoning, but almost always with a sense of a paradox to be negotiated or ironically overcome. Thus, when late moderns came across, say, Saint Anselm's famous phrase, faith-seeking understanding, fides quorum intellectium, they're often predisposed to see it, at best, as slightly duplicitous, at worst as expressing somewhat contemptible ambition, the aspiration of an irrational passion, to the dignity of a rational conviction, cold, calm, adamantine. But for Anselm, it describes something more like the natural course that reason must always take, from its initial stirrings in the act of naive conjecture to its consummation in an act of reflective knowledge. All reasoning begins from a venture of trust, whose faithfulness can be asserted only at the end of the sequence of postulates and predicates and judgments to which it gives rise. What, after all, warrants our belief in the power of rational consciousness to give us a true knowledge of reality? Whether we wish to acknowledge it or not, there is a fiduciary moment within every act of reason which allows for thought's first movement towards ends beyond itself. It is an implicit trust in an original accord between mind and world, mysterious but indissoluble. And it is one that, protest how we may, makes sense only if we presume some original ontological unity between consciousness and being. Every attempt of the rational mind to find the truth of things involves an implicit metaphysical presumption that there is some transcendent coincidence of world and soul, some original fullness of reality, where they are always already one, which allows for their openness one to the other here below. One traditional way of saying this is that the mind and the world, according to their different modes, both participate in the same eternal forms, but that merely differs in the epistemological enigma to a higher level of reality. Even this accord between intelligence and intelligible forms seems necessarily to point towards some still higher, more eminent unity in the simplicity of a first principle, in God. Only this permits us to believe that being is already manifestation, that it is by nature intelligible and comes to fruition as it discloses itself in soul. There is a reciprocal transparency of mind and world, an essential belonging of each to the other, because in their transcendent source, they are one. This is not, of course, the common sense view of the matter today. Certainly, those who most like to flatter themselves that they are the austerest of rationalists, that is, atheists, materialists, metaphysical naturalists, and that crowd, would find the notion that reason arises from an irreducible fiduciary movement of the will, risible even perhaps sordid. But notoriously, this creates something of a dilemma. For someone who takes, for instance, a rigorously Darwinian line, purged of all metaphysical postulates, that there may exist a fortuitous correlation between mind and world, but certainly no essential harmony. Any congruence between thought and its object is a kind of functional, mechanical miracle, so to speak, achieved by incalculable ages of gradual adaptation and evolutionary attrition. So the world is not really known. It does not truly disclose itself as thought because it has no ontological disposition to do so. And reason, whatever that may be, may work, but it cannot reveal. The division between mind and world admits of no mediation. All this being so, the unyielding rationalist turns out to be the most irrational fatalist of all, one who believes in reason even though there cannot possibly be any reason for that belief. It's tempting sometimes to read the whole history of modern continental philosophy as a cautionary fable regarding this divorce of reason from faith. Certainly one sees the first clear signs of their estrangement from another in Descartes' vision of philosophy not primarily as a task of translating the splendor of being into luminous concepts, but rather as a rational reconstruction of reality erected upon the fundamentum inconcussum of subjective certitude, meaning I cannot doubt that I think, and so my thinking is the indeducible principle upon which the trustworthiness of the world depends. In a sense, Descartes sought to find faith in reason, or to find a reason for faith, but his project, some enormous inversion of philosophical expectations, had already occurred. The philosopher does not start from a faith in being's intelligible disclosure of itself. In fact, he starts by explicably abjuring such faith, but rather vests his trust in the power of the self to posit reality from its own unshakable position. Thereafter, it was only a short path to Kant's critically idealist abandonment of the world, quote, in itself, unquote, and retreat to the world available only to the human apparatus of perception. And an even shorter path led to, quote, absolute, unquote, idealism's pangs of metaphysical nostalgia and its attempt to reintegrate mind and world by forcing human reason to assume the burden of their ontological unity. The synthesis was, of course, inherently unstable. The grand, opulent, rococo edifice of Hegel's system rested upon so shallow a foundation that it could not fail to collapse under the weight of its own magnificence. In proposing the, quote, idea, unquote, capital I, as the wellspring of both nature and history, working itself out by converting the inconclusiveness of time into the universality of spirit, the Hegelian project invented the final triumph of sheer eventuality over rational order. At the denouement of the story, faith and reason are, quote, reunited, unquote, but only in the trivial sense that they dissolve into the most common mist. This was the, quote, liberating, unquote, discovery of postmodern philosophy, that delirious season of festive nihilism. Having forsaken its fiduciary ground, reason becomes pure positing, sheer assertion. Without that original trust, that spiritual commitment, reason is not reason at all, but the purest irrationality, a game of will. When faith and reason are truly separated from one another, neither can stand upon its own. Like all cautionary tales, this one has a moral, but I'm not sure I should presume to say precisely what it is. It has something to do with acknowledging that, in its very sense, all reasoning involves a venture of trust in an original orientation of truth to the mind, and of the mind to truth, and in the ultimate unity of the two, and that, therefore, any attempt to argue from rational premises to rational conclusions that resolutely refuse to invoke what is and has always been revealed in the mind's most primordial encounter with reality is not really a process of reasoning at all, but just a journey toward absurdity. To put the matter in vaguely Platonic fashion, we must enjoy a vision of the truth before we can reason our way to it. That is, we are always striving to remember something in which we, in some sense, already know, but do not yet understand. And that was David Bentley Hart, Reason's Faith, an article in First Things, March 2015. That was densely packed, a lot of big words there. I skipped some of them even. What he says is that ultimately it takes faith to postulate anything. Those who oppose him, saying that that's just a leap of faith. You're saying that this is revealed to you by God, and that, in our view of materialism, is nonsense. And he's saying to them, by not having any ontological starting point for reality, your view is just as much a leap of faith as you're accusing me of having. And he lays out the logic really well. He takes these little jabs in there too, if you pay attention. I'm going to be linking the article so you can pick over this slowly if you're at all interested in this kind of thing. Not everybody is going to be interested in philosophy. The way he sort of verbally eviscerates his opponents is clever, and it seems sort of rare that people do this kind of philosophical work so concisely and winningly. I'll just read over a few points that I thought were interesting. What he says here, in our time, any argument for the eminent goods to transcend ends must be prepared for an attempt to, quote, recover the world, so to speak, a deeper, wider tuition of sensibility, imagination, and natural reverence. So what he's saying is we have to, when we're looking at reality and we're looking at something like the common good or the greater good, we have to dive deeper into our sensibility, imagination, and natural reverence. And those things are really tied up with reason and faith. And they point at least to theism. He says, all reasoning begins from a venture of trust, whose truthfulness can be asserted only at the end of the sequence of postulates and predicates and judgments which it gives rise. All reasoning begins from a venture of trust, he says. So there is some believing as we postulate ideas about how reality works. There is some a priori believing that happens, no matter what direction we're coming from. And he speaks about transcendence in this way. Materialism is not attached to transcendence or the idea of transcendence, and yet when we think about reality, we undoubtedly wind up attaching it to transcendence because that is an ontological reality. the unity and the simplicity of a first principle in God. Only this permits us to believe that being is already a manifestation. He also brings up continental philosophy and Descartes. I think, therefore I am, is the catchphrase Descartes is known for. Descartes, I don't believe, meant to do this, but it began modern philosophy, as it were, pulling it away from God and keeping it wrapped up in our minds, making our thinking the starting point for our understanding reality. He really speaks of the bankruptcy of this, but not just that, where it led, where it leads us to. And he speaks of where we are in postmodern philosophy as a delirious season of festive nihilism. And nihilism or nihilism is a very hopeless place to be. It winds up being very cynical. And it's difficult when you're in a postmodern world that is awash in cynicism and devoid of any joy that exists beyond the transcendent. It would only be sort of in the material and not transcending beyond anything that you can really measure. And there's something about that winds up being very nihilistic and seemingly futile. He speaks of the venture to trust an original orientation of truth to the mind winds up being a journey toward absurdity. And finally, he says we must enjoy a vision of the truth before we can reason our way to it. In Platonic terms, there are forms and there are ideals to which we move toward. But for those to exist, there must be something beyond ourselves to which we are imagining. And to imagine something beyond ourselves is to imagine the source or the ontological, the isness of something, the ontological form of something. And materialism can't do that. It collapses under its own weight. Every once in a while, I nerd out like this. And for those of you who are tuning in for something a little lighter, I apologize. This is probably best understood not hearing it perhaps, but reading it. And so I will offer that in the show notes. Come by sparkmymuse.com to click to that, or go to sparkmymuse.substack.com and get a direct link to this article. I'm on a David Bentley Hart phase right now and digging into some philosophical things that I find really invigorating. I want to let you know that next week I will be bringing you the conversation I had with Cassidy Hall on her new book, Queering Contemplation. It's a fascinating conversation we have, and we include things like ritual participation, a really interesting section about boredom and nature. There's so many parts of the conversation that were just so enjoyable and insightful. I know you're going to get quite a lot out of it. So join me next week. Pass along this show to someone you think might enjoy it. I would really appreciate that. And if you can become a sponsor of this show at a couple dollars a month, you can go to patreon.com/sparkmymuse to become a monthly sponsor. At $5 or more, you automatically unlock anything that's a paid reading at Substack. So that's a kind of double prize. One-time gifts are highly enjoyed and appreciated as well. And I thank you so much, listeners out there, friends out there who share my work, who come back week after week. I love you for that. Thank you so much. Blessing and peace to you.